Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to have a discussion today about an age-old topic in Wuthering Waves. The conversation, waifu versus meta. And today, I think it's obvious that we have found a definitive answer to that eternal struggle that many players are having. Meta is not real. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I do believe that the meta and meta value and meta importance when it comes to whether or not a person pulls a character, ladies and gentlemen, it's fake. It's not actually real. And I have all of the proof for it in front of you today. And really, we're going to be using the Pride Win tier list over here as a way for us to actually show that proof. Because I think at this point, most people can unilaterally agree, at least for like the top couple of placements, this is kind of indicative of how meta relevant various units are in the game. And the discussion is going to be very, very, very simple over here, and it's going to center on one character in particular that got released in version 3.2. You might be seeing her on the screen already. That character is called Sigrika. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the little like milkmaid looking Royan tribeswoman that summons a bunch of teddy bears and plushies in combat. She is, at a baseline, the strongest unit in the game when it comes to both game modes. The only Tier 0 unit when it comes to Tower of Adversity and Whimpering Wastes. But do you also want to know some of the other accolades, some of the other titles that this Sigrika character happens to have? We're using this post over here that talks a lot of shit about Wuthering Waves. But in this circumstance, we're going to be able to use it as a compliment. This website was tracking some of the sales forecasts for Sigrika during her banner over here from March 19th to April 9th. What do we see over here? Bro, she might have been the worst performing banner in the history of the game. Literally, the worst performing banner in the history of the game. And then when you combine that with some other data points, right, that show us some recent releases like Hiyuki, second in the Steam store, ranked at its lowest like 10 in a bunch of different regions, you can kind of see what's going on over here. Sigrika is a unit that nobody really pulled in this game. Then you take a look, right, at some other like statistics over here, things that show ownership numbers, right? You see Imith up here at the top, Shorekeeper, Cardathea, Chisa, Jinsei, all those units. And then look who you see at the bottom. The most unowned female unit in the history of the game is Sigrika, ladies and gentlemen. You're probably understanding exactly what I'm talking about over here. This unit only has higher ownership than Luke Herson and Brandt. And she's also unilaterally the strongest unit in the game. If meta was truly the defining factor, ladies and gentlemen, as to whether or not people want to pull a character, this unit would be close to the top. This unit would potentially be the highest owned character in the game because there's nobody else that gets it done to the same level of performance that she does in all of the endgame modes within this game. She is probably the strongest character that exists, but she's also, at a baseline, one of the lowest owned units in the game. On the other hand, you've got units, right, with very, very, very strong story appeal. Your Imiths, your Yunos, your Chisas, and of course, your Cardatheas that are taking up the prime slot when it comes to whether or not people are actually pulling them. Story in this game, ladies and gentlemen, actually seems to be the driving factor when it comes to whether or not people are going to pull a character. And it just so happens, right? It just so happens that the most popular units in the story do end up having some of the strongest overall meta performance. That's just something that Kuro ends up doing. But in these odd circumstances where we have outliers like this happening, let's just be honest here. Kuro has basically hit the nail on the head, at least in my opinion, when it comes to motivating people to pull for a unit. Because they don't have to rely on the age-old Genshin Impact tactic, or really the HSR tactic, or the Zenless Zone Zero tactic to get people pulling characters. Do you all remember this recent unit that released in Genshin Impact? Fucking Adventurers Guild, like, secretary, like, obviously not even close to lore relevant at all. Complete, like, joker of a unit when it comes to story implementation. Bro, she does so much damage, heals, buffs, does fucking everything, breaks the game, ruins the endgame, mandatory to clear the hardest content. You have freaks like this entering the roster and completely destroying the meta. I think that she's the unit that raised the damage ceiling in the game by like an additional 50k or some shit like that. And then you need her for Stygian Onslaught. You need her for all these different things. Stronger than the Geo Archon, though that's Zhongli, so of course people are going to be stronger than that. That's what Genshin Impact does with their character releases, guys. That's what they do to incentivize people to pull. Kuro Games instead went ahead and released, bar none, the strongest fucking unit in the game across both game modes that uses the strongest sub DPS in the game across both those game modes. And she's one of the lowest performing banners in the history of the game. That just means that Kuro knows, in their back pocket, designing broken fucking characters that threaten the balance, right? Designing ridiculous units that raise the damage ceiling. That's not gonna make them sell. What's gonna make them sell is making units that people actually want to own. The units that do well in the story, that appeal to players, and have people pull for them in that way. The opposite side of the spectrum over here is what I want to show right now. What's a unit that we saw at the top of ownership rates over here, at least in CN? Chisa. Bro, this character is the opposite of meta relevant. I've never seen a more dog shit unit in the history of like a gacha game before following their release. Do you know how useless this character was for the entirety of like post-release until the 3.3 update? She was possibly the worst pull in the history of the game. Chisa's only team composition on her release was with Cardathea and Chikona. And the only way that Chisa was going to be better than the completely free Arrow Rover was to do this. Chisa had to be pulled, have a crazy build, and then also be level 90 at the same time with her signature to be slightly better than a completely free-to-play Arrow Rover. That was this unit following her release. That was in November. She was basically dog shit for 6 whole months, half the fucking year. But she still ended up being one of the highest owned units in the game, despite having, I think, the least meta relevance out of any 5-star unit release for pretty much half of a year. Kuro basically got away with murder over here. How do you release a unit that sells this well but is a complete piece of shit when it comes to the meta? And then, I guess they got caught over here as well, where they release a meta-shattering character, but don't do that great of a job with her story. Don't do that great of a job when it comes to her design, but make her a ridiculous DPS powerhouse that breaks the game, and then still nobody wants to pull her. I think it's pretty simple. We're never going to have this issue. We're never going to run into a situation, or I hopefully pray that by now we're never going to run into a situation where Kuro needs to do shit like this, where they need to design the endgame to be an absolute disaster if you don't pull the latest new units. Think about what it's like in HSR. Think about what it's like in ZZZ. Think about what it's like in Genshin Impact. If you don't pull the latest on-banner unit, the endgame becomes a chore, or in some cases, literally impossible. That's what they're doing across all 3 of their games. And in this title, there's no need at all to do that, because Kuro's actively incentivized against making units like Sigrika ever again. Why go ahead and release these units that are raising the damage ceiling, right? Where the only appeal to getting them is so that you can clear the endgame easier, when they don't even sell in the fucking first place. They're getting a negative incentive to power creep the game, a negative incentive to throwing the balance out of whack for sales. While Hoyoverse, on the other hand, across all 3 of its games, they're positively incentivized to do that. And I don't even need to pull up the fucking glue when it comes to shit like, oh, those ridiculous elation teams in HSR where you gotta pull Yao Guang, and then you also gotta pull Sparksy, you also gotta pull Silverwolf, and you also gotta pull all these characters. Then you had Remembrance as well, way back in the previous year. Then you got the Angels of Delusion and that retarded boss with the shield. And now you got the Stygian Onslaught Gecko and this fucking freak over here. That's the difference in endgames, ladies and gentlemen. That's the difference in waifu versus meta. And that's the difference of the very, very, very clear approach over here that Kuro Games has when it comes to character design. You want to know one thing that's obvious about Hiyuki? Bro, she is not close to the best character in the game. She is not even close to Imith's level of performance. That's a fact. You take Imith and compare her in any way to Hiyuki across a variety of different team comps, and Hiyuki is just worse. And then maybe, right, Hiyuki, when she gets a new release, her Glacial Chase sub DPS, she might be at the same level as Imith, but as for now, she really isn't even there. That's how we're approaching balance in this game. While Genshin, ZZZ, HSR, those motherfuckers are just raising the damage ceiling every single patch. There's a funny post over here that I'll leave you off with. If you think Genshin or HSR power creep is bad, just remember that Wuwa has an empty space between tier 0 and tier 1. All they're showing is that one of the most recent released characters in the game is not the highest rated one. You can literally see here, that's Hiyuki with the new symbol. And all they're doing is showing is that older releases are better than Hiyuki. That's not how power creep works, retard. But then again, these are the players, ladies and gentlemen, that are coming from nonsense like this. I bet it makes a ton of sense why they are the way that they are. Let me know what you all thought. Peace out.